There's only about 2 weeks left before the state starts its next fiscal year. Will lawmakers and the governor be able to get it together and pass some kind of a budget? We'll talk about that next on Capitol View. Thank you for tuning in to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues and Illinois Public Radio. And joining us today is Charlie Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's always good to be here.
And Brian Mackey with Illinois Public Radio. Brian, glad you're back.
Thanks, Jamey.
So we are in the summer of the ongoing grind of will there or won't there be a budget before the fiscal year begins, the next fiscal year. Of course, would be starting the second fiscal year without a state budget if that were to happen. Brian, we saw some more back and forth this week from the governor and the speaker. What's going on this week with the budget?
Nothing. I guess it's the same story. We'll see you next week. Not much is happening. The governor continues to beat the drum, saying that he now wants a stopgap budget, which, in case people haven't been paying attention for the last few weeks, is a significant departure from the previous year, where he'd said he would only agree to a budget if legislators also passed his controversial agenda. And so now he's abandoned that, at least for the time being, and wants just a sort of bare bones skeleton budget that is enough to keep the lights on in state government. Literally, perhaps. There are concerns about prison vendors not supplying things that keep the prisoners fed and the lights on and the water running. We've seen a couple of state parks that had to shut down, and then they were able to reopen because the state kind of begged and pleaded with the vendors and got the services restored. But there are some negotiations happening, but at the highest level, the governor keeps beating the drum, saying pass this temporary budget, and the legislature so far has not publicly, at least, committed to following that course of action.
Well, and Democrats at one point, at least some, said they wanted a stopgap budget. The governor wants a stopgap budget. So what's going on here? I mean, there's a stopgap for social services already on his desk that a lot of folks support. He doesn't want to sign it. So what are the points of contention that we can at least see externally?
Well, as you said, some Democrats want a stopgap budget. That would be Senate President John Cullerton, who is thought of as a deal maker. He likes to make deals. He likes to keep things moving. On the other hand, House Speaker Michael Madigan has said that he does not appreciate the way the governor has sought to bring in what the speaker calls non-budget issues into the budget-making process, and is concerned that if there is another stopgap budget, it's just going to prolong this, and he says there ought to really be a full budget. Now, whether that's where he ultimately comes out, he may agree to the stopgap. For now, we don't know. A lot of this, I think, hinges on concerns about who's going to get blamed if the schools can't open in August, because as little the people watching this show notwithstanding, most people in Illinois don't pay very close attention to state government, and if the schools were to not open this August, or even earlier for some of the handful of year-round districts, that will be a real wake-up call to people in this state that something is terribly wrong in state government. And I think that the governor doesn't want to be seen as taking the blame for that. He would like, if that happens, the Democrats to take the blame for it, and vice versa. So I think that that's in the back of everyone's minds right now.
Well, and Charlie, we saw the governor veto yet another spending bill that would have given some money to social services and higher ed at the end of last week. Yeah. What's going on there? I mean, we keep seeing this cycle of Democrats sending him the spending and him rejecting it.
Well, the irony to me, as Brian mentioned, Senate President John Cullerton suggested a stopgap. This was after one of their relatively rare leader meetings. And it was like on a Thursday or a Friday, and the Rauner administration dumped all over that idea and thought it was terrible. Fast forward a couple days over the weekend, and suddenly the governor wants a stopgap. And he presented a budget that would, as Brian said, it would cover some essential services basically through the November election until the end of this calendar year, which would be halfway into the new fiscal year, and would fund schools all year round. It would be a full year budget for schools. And of course, you remember what happened last year. The Democrats sent the governor a budget in maybe a couple dozen separate appropriation bills, Rauner vetoed all of them, save for the bill that allocated money for elementary and secondary education, which he signed, which allowed the schools to operate this past academic year. But without that authority going forward, a lot of school districts won't be able to open on time. Now, all school districts get revenues from property taxes, and those property tax revenues will be coming in. The first installment has been paid already. The second installment is due late summer, early fall. Here in Sangamon County, it's due the first week of September. So that would be an influx of money, but certainly not enough to last any appreciable amount of time without the state assistance.
And there's talk, Charlie, of some schools potentially borrowing against knowing that money is coming in, but schools have been kind of dealing with this late payments and not getting the full amount that they typically get. So some of them are kind of running to the end of being able to do those credit options and all, patch it over, right?
They're at a real desperate position. Historically, there's always been, for want of a better term, games played with the final school aid payment. Most of the money the state sends to local school district comes in the form of something called general state aid, and there are periodic payments. It's like every month. And back in the day, if things were tight at the state level and they wanted to hold down the spending for the fiscal year, instead of getting the final payment in mid-June, it would be delayed until like July 3rd or something and roll over into the next fiscal year, so it would look better on the books. And so school districts are kind of accustomed to dealing with that kind of nonsense. But the uncertainty of not having anything, because back when they were playing those games, everybody knew what the game was. Everybody knew, okay, it's going to be resolved. There was never this fear that maybe nothing will happen. And that's kind of where we are now.
Well, and I think all of us in Illinois have a bit of a case of maybe impasse fatigue, Brian. I mean, we've seen a full year without a budget, and folks, are kind of wondering, people who aren't directly affected by it, what does it mean? I haven't seen a lot of impact. What would this mean if we go into the fiscal year without a budget? Besides schools, you touched on a little bit, prisons and other parts of state government that could be in some real trouble here, right?
Yeah, I don't think we really know what it looks like. I think a lot of people who follow state government closely are shocked that we've been able to go along as much as we have. And really, if you take a step back and say, you look at the state constitution, which says there shall be no spending without legal appropriations. The General Assembly there are some ongoing appropriations, so the pension payments get made, the bondholders get repaid, legislators get paid now, following the shenanigans that former Governor Pat Quinn tried to pull a few years ago. But for the most part, this stuff requires legislative action. And I think a lot of people are just shocked that the courts have not been asked to come back in. And we had a couple of individual trial judges who said all state employees can get paid. And we've had some other judges say that people who get certain social services from the state, health care services, those can get paid. But I think it's kind of stunning that there hasn't been more of a constitutional crisis or other crisis. And now you have a lot of companies, whether you're a trash hauler or an electricity provider or a small town water district that provides water to a prison, who have gone probably coming up on a year, if not longer, given the backlog in payments, without any money. And there was a story this week out of Western Illinois Correctional Center is facing a water shutoff possibility. The city there is owed between $300,000 and $400,000, depending on whether you take the city's view or the state's view. And you have this, so if they vote to do that, what's the Department of Corrections going to do? It's going to have to move those prisoners out. It's going to have to bring in tanker trucks full of water for the time being. I mean, this could be a crisis, a big, big crisis. But for a lot of little social service organizations that are that have state contracts, the state said, please keep doing what you do. We'll eventually pay you. They've been in a crisis situation for months already. Some of them have had to lay off staff and shut down. And
as a matter of fact, haven't they filed suit?
Yeah, a number of them. Yeah, a number of these groups have filed suit as well. Yeah, exactly. They have contracts with state government. Of course, again, those contracts typically say subject to appropriation, so it's an open question as to whether the courts are going to allow that. But one of the things that I think is so challenging, and it was illustrated in how the Department of Corrections responded to the story that Mount Sterling might shut off the water to Western Illinois Correctional Center, is they said, it's the failure of the majority party to pass a balanced budget and enact structural reforms. And structural reforms is the governor's kind of PR, political communications way of saying my controversial agenda, to weaken labor unions and help businesses out and term limit those evil Democrats in the legislature.
The term limits would apply to everyone.
They would, but I think he's been clear about we need to get rid of Madigan and the politicians he controls as well. And I think that you have to hold two opposing ideas in your head at the same time. You have to hear the governor saying, oh, we don't want a crisis, it's the Democrats who are creating the crisis, but also remember that it has been the administration's insistence on we got to have these quote-unquote structural reforms, i.e. his controversial agenda passed, before he would negotiate on the budget. And it's difficult to sometimes reconcile what you hear the governor saying about how terrible it is that there's a crisis, and also keep in mind, though, that he has in large part fomented many, many aspects of this crisis. So we're entering into, I've used this cliche before, uncharted waters, whatever you want to say. We're going off the edge of the map, and it's frightening, I think, too, for probably a lot of people out there in Illinois.
Well,
and to me, the bottom line is it's both parties, the governor and his Republicans, House Speaker Michael Madigan, Senate President John Cullerton, and their Democrats in the legislature wanting to avoid responsibility for raising taxes. Everybody agrees that we can't make cuts of the dimension required to balance the budget without savaging education, human services, healthcare, the kind of things that people say over and over again in public opinion polls that they really care about. We can't make those cuts. To balance the budget, we have to raise taxes. And everybody who's looked at this without ideological blinders on realizes that's the case. So now it's a matter of
including the governor.
Pin the tail on donkey. He's going to take responsibility.
Who's going to get stuck with it?
And the fact is, all the years I watched state government, in a situation like this, the leaders would sit down and say, okay, here's what's needed for the good of the state. They'd agree on how high taxes should be for how long, and then there'd be what would be called a structured roll call, where I, as the Republican leader, would say, I'm going to put on X number of my members. You, as the Democratic leader, would say, I'll put on the remainder needed, or vice versa. And people would vote for it. And because both parties supported it, and because the governor, who in most of these instances was a Republican, signed it, it kind of diffused it as a political issue. And so you wouldn't have a governor running around saying, it's Mike Madigan, he wants to force this dramatic income tax hike. And you wouldn't have Democrats saying, it's the governor wanting to savage working people. And so there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of communication, there's, I guess, a lack of recognition of the damage that's being done by these people who've got these hard-nosed opposing views and don't see fit to compromise, at least publicly. Now, as Brian said, these working groups are meeting, and one's hope would be that out of the limelight, rank and file lawmakers can put aside this nonsense that they hear from the top of the food chain and find some common ground. And I think you could on something like workers' compensation, because historically we've done it. Now, we're not going to do away with collective bargaining, as the governor would like. That's just off the table, because Democrats will never be for that. Might you have some modifications? The governor likes to point out that the legislature modified what could be collectively bargaining with the Chicago Teachers Union. What he doesn't mention is that those changes were negotiated, and the CTU agreed to those, not happily, reluctantly, but that was something that labor had acquiesced in. And so, yeah, you could pass that legislation. So, again, not to sound like a broken record or some old curmudgeon, but back in the day, the leadership would sit down, they'd find common ground, because they would realize this partisan standoff really is hurting the most vulnerable people in our state.
And if I could just pick up on something Charlie said, I do think though you mentioned that the leaders would come together, and there's something you said that really struck me, for the good of Illinois and make this compromise. And I think that that is one of the problems now. Somebody asked me a week ago, who's the good guy here, right? Is it, or are there any good guys in Springfield?
Yeah.
And I think the problem is that both sides think they are the white knight. You have Speaker Madigan, who says the governor wants to hurt the middle class, and his policies are going to, send people to the emergency room instead of getting workers' compensation and things like that, and degrade the quality of lives of union construction workers and policemen and firemen and garbage haulers and other things like that. And then you have the governor, who seems to have a passionate personal belief that, one, Speaker Madigan has been terrible for the state of Illinois, and his power is the root of a lot of things that he views that are wrong with the state of Illinois. And two, particularly that government employee unions have far too much clout and influence and cost the taxpayers too much through pensions and salaries and benefits, healthcare, things like that. And I think that there's so much self-righteousness on each side that has complicated efforts at compromise, because compromise is basically giving up something that is core to what each of these politicians thinks they're here to do, or at least says they're here to do.
Well, and Charlie touched on public opinion and kind of how this plays into these decisions, maybe being not tough, but unpopular when it comes to cutting spending or raising taxes. Brian, you talked to someone from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute this week who looked kind of back over public opinion in recent years on some of these very issues. And what did he have to say?
Yeah, this is John Jackson, who, along with a couple other people at the Simon Institute, look back from 2008 to the present. And basically, the big thing they found, this is not very surprising, is that voters don't like tax hikes. They're very opposed to that. But they also found that voters want a lot of services. And the politicians in Illinois have been selling people a line for a long time that, well, we need to keep taxes low, and we also need to keep services up. I was reminded particularly, Pat Quinn, if you are somebody who's a fiscal conservative, you might say to his credit, a number of years ago when he was governor, suggested closing 14 major state facilities one year. This is 2012, I think. A couple of prisons, a couple mental health centers, a couple developmental centers, and a bunch of smaller offices around the state. And as you would expect, the local lawmakers were very upset. They don't want the prison in my area closed. Yeah, we spend too much. There's too much waste in government, except for the prison in my hometown. That's jobs. That's an economic engine. And one of the state senators at the time said, these people are fiscal conservatives until it comes to their area, then they're New Deal Democrats, basically. And I think that that's true also of the voters in Illinois. I think that they have come to believe what politicians have been telling them. Even though there is plenty of contradictory evidence out there in the media and elsewhere, there are other storylines being offered, but they accept, it's just waste. If we just only cut the waste and corruption out of Illinois government, then we would be able to balance the budget. And as Charlie said, there's no one in state government, well, at least no one serious in state government, who doesn't think you need a combination of tax hikes and revenue cuts. That's what Speaker Madigan says, and it's even what Governor Rauner says, although he won't say exactly which taxes he would increase. He has said he will agree to a tax increase if he gets his other aspects of his agenda passed.
But before we blame all this mess on the voters, Charlie, I mean, you pointed out that the state's leaders have sold in the past this idea that we can have everything and not have to pay taxes, and the behavior of our politicians has definitely led some folks to believe that corruption is rampant, and that if we just cut that out, that things would be okay.
Yeah, and I've often said, as Brian suggested, there's no line item in the state budget that says waste, fraud, and abuse that the governor can veto. There's sloppy practices, there could be improvements, but not to the tune of, $7 billion in a general funds budget of roughly $35 billion. There's not that level of waste. And big chunks of that go out, for example, to local schools. Now, is somebody suggesting that the money that goes to local school districts, like District 186 here, or the surrounding communities, that money is being wasted? Now, people would say, well, you're paying the teachers too much. Are you? Do you want to get somebody who's working minimum wage because that's all their qualifications enable them to do, to be teaching your kid? I sure wouldn't. And so it's this perception, and yeah, there are bad apples in the barrel that reinforce this notion, oh, here's a bad apple, that means the rest of the barrel is rotten. But that's not reality. And as a matter of fact, voters are willing to re-elect people who vote for tax increases if it's well spelled out and if it's a bipartisan agreement. So you can't run around as the Republican campaign apparatus says and suggest, oh, Senator so-and-so, Representative so-and-so is doing Mike Madigan's bidding and he wants to raise your income taxes. Well, if it's a bipartisan agreement, then I, as the Democratic candidate, can say, yeah, we raised your income taxes, but guess what? Governor Rauner signed it. The Republican leaders in the Senate and the House were on board on that roll call. That's the way you diffuse this. And as a matter of fact, I actually went, as you know, and looked at the list of who's running in November. And here's the list. These are all the folks who are on the ballot. I went through the legislature and I counted up how many legislative candidates actually have challenges in November among the incumbent lawmakers. And I came out that 48 of the current Senate of the 59 don't face opposition in November. Either there's nobody from the other party filed or they're retiring. In the House, it's 74. And so you have these folks more than enough to pass legislation, even with an extraordinary majority, who have no opposition in November. Somebody could write a name in. That's not going to work. So basically, all they have to do is show up first Tuesday in November, vote for themselves, and bam, they're in. And so there's really little or no danger. It's not that it's this kind of do or die profile in courage. It's more like a profile in a little less cowardice, you might say.
A less popular book by far.
Yes.
Well, if you look at it historically, which another thing I've done, being a nerd, people who voted for tax increases from 1969 when Ogilvy proposed the income tax and got it through the legislature with the help of Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley, and go through the increases under Thompson, under Edgar, when Edgar campaigned on keeping income tax rates where they were. People who voted yes got elected at a better percentage than people who voted no. And the reason is because they were structured roll calls, and people who were in shaky districts didn't have to vote for it. They could vote no in both parties. People who were absolutely safe were the ones who voted for it, and they got reelected. And even the tax increase that the Democrats put through unilaterally, what was it, lame duck session of
2011.
2011, I think, was when it occurred in early January. The folks who ran the following November, who were on the ballot, who voted yes, every single one of them got reelected. Among the people who voted no, 3 or 4 Republicans were defeated. So this notion that if I vote for a tax increase, I'm dead meat, I don't think that holds water.
Well, and even though there aren't that many contested races, maybe, Brian, in November, we are going to see a lot of money poured into those. We're already seeing ads. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the ads that are already
Yeah,
happening?
it's really early, but the Republican apparatus in the state, technically the House Republican organization, although Governor Rauner has so much money sort of sloshing around the Republican Party that I think a lot of this can be traced back to basically him, or you could say it's his doing, is running ads against 3 Democrats in Southern Illinois, State Senator Gary Forby and State Representatives Brandon Phelps and John Bradley. And the ads, typical campaign ad, the angry or ominous voice, they're taking orders from Mike Madigan and not in Springfield. One of the things that Republicans have been hitting Democrats for recently is canceling the sessions that were planned for every Wednesday this month. They have not followed through on any of those, despite the speaker saying they would be in continuous session. As the day approached, he would send out a news release that says, we really don't have anything to vote on. The working groups are still negotiating, so let's let them do their job. When people are in Springfield, tensions can run high, and I think he just wants to keep the lawmakers who are not involved in that process away from the press corps
And if there's
and away
nothing to
from
vote
each
on
other.
them, a lot of them won't show up because they're going to be on
And that's
vacation
true.
with their
You have
families and that
vacations and
sort
things
of
like
thing.
that. Yeah. So this ad is saying, they're not in Springfield. Well, lo and behold, we were coming out of the governor's news conference in the Capitol on Wednesday of this past week. And who do we see but State Senator Gary Forby, one of these targets. He's a Democrat from Southern Illinois. He's somebody that has been a so-called Tier 1 target more times than he can probably remember, and they have not yet succeeded in toppling him, but they're trying again this year. Because he is he's a Democrat in what has become a fairly red area of Illinois, right? It's a fairly conservative downstate area. But he's pro-gun. I mean, he has aspects of him that, that fit well with that. Anyways, he says...
Well, he fits his district.
He does. He fits his district. And he says, well, I'm here in the Capitol. I'm in these working groups. We have politicians who are perhaps compromise-minded, really sincerely showing up, trying to get things done. And yet we also have the political apparatus kicking in and kind of kicking them in the back as they're trying to negotiate at the same time. The governor has said we can walk and chew gum at the same time and doesn't really think that that's going to affect negotiations.
Doing politics and negotiating the budget.
Doing this very hardball politics while also trying to reach some sort of compromise. A couple of Democrats, including Senate President John Cullerton, have said, it would help if you just backed off a little bit and let us negotiate. If you want to compromise with us, stop attacking us in the press and on television advertisements.
Well, I would give the governor credit for resisting this notion of calling people back for a special session. You don't need them around here until there's something ready for them to vote on. And if the governor calls a special session, then lawmakers will get per diem and travel. As it is now, we're Cullerton and Madigan to bring the legislature back in regular session. There would be no per diem because it's past the May 31st cutoff date. So the governor is actually saving, what is it, $40, $50?
Yeah, and he said I wanted to pay for it myself, but I don't know if they probably wouldn't let me. So.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that for this week. I'd like to thank my guests Charlie Wheeler and Brian Mackey, and I'm your host Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.